Hello, hello everyone. We are live today with Gill Rapley from who is the author of Babyled Weaning book that is so popular in our group, and I'm very honored to have you on the call tonight, Gill. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Many of the parents in this group, are in that stage when they start to wean the baby, and they've asked a lot of questions about baby-led weaning, and basically they do recommend your book often. And I personally did baby-led weaning with my second child because it was so much easier than trying to feed my baby with a spoon, and it felt so much more natural. And it works better for sure. But still, even if we do it, we still have questions during the process. Yes. And it's sometimes a bit difficult to trust that, the child will have everything he needs and that it's going to be okay. And or is the child going to eat, when he's a toddler, so later on, and all these questions, started to come up in most of the discussion we had about it. So, yeah, it's great to have you tonight to answer some of those questions.
Okay, fire away.
First thing I wanted to ask you is to introduce yourself and, your backgrounds, and did you come to write a book about baby-led weaning?
Well, it starts really from my work as a health visitor. I've also been a midwife and a breastfeeding counsellor. But as a health visitor, I saw many, many families, parents and babies, struggling with solid foods. And it seemed that letting the baby feed himself or herself was the answer, made everything easier. But of course, you couldn't do that until 6 months when the baby is able to pick things up. So in the days when we were starting at 4 months, it was only an answer to a problem later on. It wasn't the way to start. But that was what motivated me. And I think because of my interest in breastfeeding also, it was the realization that babies are very, very clever and very capable, and that so many of the problems we see are where we're interfering with the baby's instincts instead of trying to understand them and use them. I could tell a little bit about Tracy in the hope she will be able to join us. Her background is in journalism, and we met because she had heard about baby-led weaning and she'd done it with her daughter, and she wanted to interview me, and we hit it off and we decided to write a book together. The book was really, baby-led weaning was already becoming very popular over the internet well before we wrote the book. And part of what prompted us to do it was that some of the stories that were being shared were perhaps talking about things that weren't really what I considered to be baby-led weaning. Some of them were even possibly unsafe. So we wanted to document what it actually was, so that there was something out there for people to refer to. And also people were asking us, why don't you write a book? So we did.
Yeah, and it's a brilliant book, and it helps so many parents, and the cookbook is brilliant as well, because obviously that's one of the main advantage of baby-led weaning. Is like you cook for the whole family. You don't have to do different meal for the baby. Obviously you need to be careful with the salt content, but for us it was very practical, basically. That's really what I remember, because it was 6 years ago.
We've also actually got 5 books out now, because we wrote baby-led breastfeeding and baby-led parenting, and then we've recently added a quick and easy recipe book for baby-led weaning. So we've found something that we can do well together.
That's good, brilliant. And yeah, I discovered that you did baby-led breastfeeding that I haven't read yet, and the baby-led parenting that must be, totally up my street, I think, and in line with what I believe in, because obviously Montessori is about following the child and respecting the child, and we totally encourage the children to feed themselves from the start, and so it's totally, for me, in line with what I teach, obviously. So yeah, in a nutshell, would you like to explain what is baby-led weaning, like the big difference? You kind of say it a bit, but yeah.
Yeah, it's about shared meal times. Babies join in with the rest of the family. It follows their natural development, so it uses their skills and their instincts in the way that probably nature intended them to be used, instead of the parents perhaps having to fight against those instincts. I just made a few notes, so I need to glance down occasionally. Sorry, make sure I don't miss anything. It is about healthy eating, so it's not just let your baby eat whatever he likes and all sorts of junk food. It does mean that the family does have to eat healthily, and so that the baby can share the same food. But the idea is the baby copies his parents and learns how to use cutlery and so on just by watching. They also know that the food is safe because they can see other people eating it. But the baby decides what they'll eat, how much, how quickly, which is very different from the conventional way where someone else decides how much the baby should have. Babies need time to explore food. I think one of the things that I've become even more aware of is how babies need to examine things and taste them and squash them and just discover what they are before they put them in their mouth. And we take these things for granted because the foods that we're used to. But once upon a time, we met them for the very first time. And the other thing is that when foods are presented the way they should look, so a strawberry looks like a strawberry instead of sort of pink mush, then babies can recognize a strawberry next time they see one and know what it's going to taste like. When you have baby food, even baby food prepared at home, and it's all perhaps blended together even, you get a sort of homogeneous color and homogeneous texture that doesn't help the baby learn anything about what those foods really are like.
Yeah, it's really like eating, basically. It's a sensorial experience. And babies learn through the five senses. So we kind of deprive them from, part of that sensorial experience when we spoon feed them, I suppose.
Yeah. The other thing that baby-led weaning does is to allow the baby to decide how and when they're going to cut down on the milk feeds. Again, that's not decided for them. As they gradually begin to eat more solid foods, so they lose their appetite for the milk feeds. And it all happens gradually with a nice long overlap, again, as nature intended.
Yeah, I think one of the questions was a bit about that, actually, about, how do we, transition from breastfeeding and obviously bottle feeding as well to baby-led weaning. Many moms were like, okay, do I need to stop? Do I need to give the food first? And I think you answered these kind of questions in your book, but, that was one of the main questions. And especially, I think many moms who breastfeed for a long time tends to do baby-led weaning. And so, if you want to answer...
Sure.
Insight about that.
The main thing to understand is that from the baby's point of view, these things that he sees his parents handling and eating and so on are nothing to do with filling his tummy. He doesn't recognize them as food. That comes much, much later when he's actually started to eat and he's beginning to realize that maybe he doesn't, if he feels hungry, that will fill his tummy just as well as milk. But at the beginning, the milk feeds, breast or bottle, are what he needs to when he's hungry. So first of all, if a baby is hungry, they should be offered their normal milk feed. It's not fair to ask them to accept solid food when what they want is their food, which is the only food they know at that point. Instead, we need to think of the solid food as sort of think of it in terms of play and learning. Forget about the eating. That will come later. And so involve the baby in the family meal times whenever those are happening, or whenever even just one parent is eating. Invite the baby to share that food if it's healthy food. And don't even think about when or where the next milk feed will happen. The baby will ask for that as normal, or maybe a little bit later than usual, may have a smaller feed as they gradually start to eat more solid food. But the baby will take care of that. We don't have to make those decisions. The only thing to remember is when you sit your baby down to offer them solid food, that they shouldn't be hungry, which is kind of goes against what people expect. They also shouldn't be feeling fractious or ill or tired, because they're not going. You wouldn't offer them a new toy if they were feeling miserable or if they were feeling hungry. So if we think of it in those terms, it's easier to see how it would fit in.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to see it, to see that as a play experience, or a sensorial experience more than something to fulfill the tummy. But at the same time, some parents are worried, and that's something that is said to parents, that babies need iron from 6 months of age, and so they do need to eat, solid food. Otherwise, they're going to lack iron. I know that it's something that has been said several times to me, even by the health visitor at the time. So I don't know, how do we answer that question? Because obviously they're not going to start to fulfill the tummy with proper food the first month, 2 months, 3 months, I don't know, from 6 months of age. So where does it come into the picture, this kind of iron level?
I think the first thing to perhaps pick out of that is that we offer food, we don't give it. So the baby is offered food, and as long as he's offered a wide range of foods, including iron-rich foods, he or she will choose what they need from that. It seems that they do seem to know which foods to go for. I've heard a lot of parents say that the first food their baby ate was a piece of meat, or the first one that they picked up and sucked, because they got a lot of iron just from sucking the juices. Iron is the kind of big thing at the moment. I think iron is presenting a problem for a couple of reasons. One is that traditionally parents always started introducing solids, in the UK anyway, with fruit and vegetables. That was what was recommended at 4 months. And what's got lost in the change to 6 months is the fact that actually, as you say, by 6 months, probably the first nutrients babies are beginning to need are iron and zinc. So those are the foods we should be starting with, not adding them in at 6 months as we would have done. Sometimes people imagine because they're going to start 2 months later than the old way, therefore they start in the same way. But we have to recognize this is a different baby with different needs. The other thing is that a lot of the research around iron and children relates to countries in the world where children are not given a very varied diet. They're certainly often not given meat as very young children, and they may be given an awful lot of cow's milk, which is very low in iron. So reports of children becoming anemic and so on often relate to those sort of populations. If the baby is offered a wide range of foods, including meat, or for vegetarian families, pulses, other foods which have a good source of iron, such as lentils, then they will be fine. And the research tells us that actually baby-led weaned babies are no more at risk of lacking iron than any other, than babies fed conventionally. One more thing about iron that's worth mentioning is that hopefully the issue of iron will become less of a worry the more babies are allowed to have their umbilical cord pulsate for a few minutes after birth, because that delivers them an extra slug of blood which is rich in iron, and means that they start off that from the beginning with bigger stores of iron which will last them easily beyond 6 months. But for those babies who had to have their cord cut very, very early, or happened to because nobody knew otherwise, it may be that they do begin to need iron from about 6 months. But as I say, as long as they're offered it, they will find it.
Yeah, it makes so much sense, and it's so reassuring to hear that. I knew about the cord, but I didn't know it was to give more iron on the long term. So I'm happy I did that for both my children, because I know in my head iron was a concern. And I totally remember my son sucking a big piece of meat for the first 2-3 months. That was his favorite food. And definitely we were having so much meat at the time because that was his favorite thing. So Tracy is there, so I'm going to add her like that she can introduce herself too, if you don't mind. That would be even better. Okay, hi Tracy, you're live, so I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Gill did do the introduction a little bit for you, but it's nice to have you on the call too. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself to everyone in this group. And thank you so much for joining us, and sorry about the kind of technical issue.
Hi everyone, I'm Tracy, and I got involved with baby-led weaning when I overheard some other mums talk about it at a baby group, and I hadn't heard of it, and they said it was incredibly easy and they loved it. They'd all been out for tapas and they'd had a lovely time. So I did it with my daughter, and I became a bit obsessed with it, and I wanted everybody to know about it. So I looked on the internet, I found Gill's name, and asked her if she'd do an interview for a magazine, and we ended up writing 5 books together.
Don't worry. Okay, so I'm coming back to the two of you to ask you the next question. With iron, I think it's maybe important as well to say that obviously, because if the mom is breastfeeding, I suppose that's also about her own diet. She has to be careful about what she eats and keep eating healthy when she's still breastfeeding, or if she chooses to breastfeed long term. Obviously, you have written a book about breastfeeding together as well, so I suppose that's something that you know about as well, and that you have done a lot of research, and you can also say something about that. But I do remember that obviously I breastfed my children quite a long time, so I was extremely careful about my own diet, knowing that obviously my children will take, everything they needed from me, so I needed to be, make sure I had the right diet. Yes.
Well, I think what happens is your body prioritizes your baby all the time. So you can have a rubbish diet, you would just feel rubbish, but your baby would take all the nutrients from your body. So you would feel tired, but your baby would be okay, as long as you had, your body always prioritizes the baby.
Kind of important for the moms to make sure she takes care of herself. Otherwise, it's becoming harder to take care of the baby as well. So yes, I did explain that obviously it's a Montessori group. So I don't know if you know anything about the Montessori education, and it's very child-led as well. And some things that we do in the Montessori, when we want to raise a child the Montessori way, we have what we call a weaning table. So instead of having the child at the dining table with us on an high chair, as soon as the child is able to sit, we have a small table and a small chair, and we encourage the child, to go to the table and to show that he wants to eat, basically, and we do that on a table. Personally, I did both, and most parents do both. They have like family dinner, and then they have snack on the small table. So I don't know if you're familiar with that concept, but many parents complain that basically most children don't want to stay on the high chair, and as soon as they can walk, they don't want to stay. So, and that the children kind of leave the table quite quickly. And I suppose that's a big part of being child-led and baby-led as well. What do you think about that? Did you try a small table and chair? Did you use a high chair all the time? Maybe more you, Tracy, because you did baby-led with your child.
Well, I didn't try the small table. I always ate with my daughter. She always ate with other people. And I think that makes a big difference because they can copy, they're involved there. It's a more sociable occasion. Once they get mobile and they can walk and they can crawl, they don't always want to be in the high chair for a long time. So once they've got a bit bored with the food, they want to get down, and that's fine. They haven't got very long times for focusing. They want to be busy. They want to get down and learn about something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's fine. It's very different in the early days when they really want to spend a lot of time focusing and exploring all the food. Then it can take a long time. But once they're mobile and they know what they're doing with food, they don't need to stay at the table. They don't need to. It's fine.
Yeah, absolutely.
They can just go off and learn about something else somewhere else.
I think it's a very interesting concept in terms of daycare, nursery setup, where other children are eating as well. I think it's brilliant for them all to be able to sit at a little table and share the meal together. But I have to say I struggle with the idea of sitting a child who is perhaps the firstborn on their own at a little table to eat separately from the parents. That doesn't feel the sociable activity that I would want to think eating is. So that's perhaps where I kind of differ slightly from the Montessori approach. But wherever there are other children eating and there are either very few adults or it's not appropriate for the adults to be eating at the same time, then absolutely a little table chair is perfect.
I think the main idea is when they're growing up, like they are. We start as babies, but honestly, I didn't feel comfortable either with that. And I'm a Montessori teacher when they were babies, but definitely when they were toddlers, they were able to kind of grab their snack, prepare their own snack, and it's that kind of gives them the independence, because sometimes, climbing on the chair and to be at the big table with a snack, it's difficult. They cannot really take a cup when they're 18 months old and go. go to the table, obviously, with a cup of water and so on. So that's why it's very interesting when they are toddlers, but maybe not so much when they are babies.
Sorry.
Not
Somebody is trying to get hold of me.
That's fine. You're a busy lady. Okay, so one of the big question from everybody asks that question, and that's in your book, so I encourage them to read as well. But was the main difference between choking and gagging, and I do remember that it's a bit frightening at first, and what you said in the book is very reassuring, and that we really stick to that. Looking at the signs that it was not choking but more gagging, and I was quickly confident that my child was able to cope with big piece of food. But I would love to have a bit more insight from you about that, because that's one of the main questions people had, and needed to have reassurance about that, basically.
I'll let you do this, Jill. You're better at explaining.
She always lets me do the choking bit, yeah. Although you've got a useful point to make about gagging. But anyway, okay, so interestingly, since we wrote the first book, and people have talked a lot about choking, and there's been some research into the risk of choking for babies fed one way or the other way. By the way, there is no greater risk been found with baby-led weaning than with conventional weaning. But actually, I think there are three things going on, not just gagging and choking, but coughing. So we have gagging, which is a sort of vomit-type reflex. If you put your finger into the back of your throat, you can make yourself gag. And it's a sort of retching movement. And interestingly, if people want to try it while they're listening, you'll find that when you do a gag, like this, your throat closes. You can't make any noise while you're gagging, and your airway is completely closed. So gagging is triggered way before the food has reached near the top of the airway. It's designed to push food farther forward for some more chewing before it's swallowed, but it doesn't show that the airway is under threat. The next sort of category and the next reflex that we see quite often is coughing. And some people, well, a lot of people call that choking. So when we talk about the risk of choking, it's not always clear what we're talking about. And unfortunately, that's the case with some of the research that's been done into choking. Parents are asked about whether their child has choked in the last few days. If their child had genuinely choked in the last few days, that child would have been at severe risk and might have had to be taken to hospital. He may have had a coughing episode, and that happens to me at least once a day, I would say. Something goes down the wrong way. And that's all it is. It's triggered that cough, which is a correct and normal and efficient reflex for keeping the airway clear. So sometimes babies will have a little coughing episode, and that happens. You can if you call that choking, then you can choke on milk, But true choking is when the airway is actually blocked, and that's not a reflex. It's when the reflex has failed or been bypassed, and it's where something's got itself lodged in the airway. Now, that's a risk when babies are feeding themselves or when they're being fed. It's a particular risk if somebody else is putting food in the baby's mouth. We've known of cases where a helpful older child thinks they're doing the baby a good turn by putting something in his mouth for him. And actually they're putting him at risk. Personally, I believe there's a very strong link between babies' ability with their hands and what they can do with the muscles of their mouth. So if they aren't able to get a food into their mouth, they're probably not ready to have it there yet. A 6-month-old baby can't pick up something small and round, so they wouldn't be able to get it into their mouth anyway. The risk comes when someone else puts it there. So as long as we let the child stay in control of what's going on, the risk is very, very small. It's never completely gone. Anyone of any age can choke. And of course, we want children to be sitting still while they're eating, not running around. And there are certain foods that we're going to prepare a certain way to cut grapes in half lengthwise, for example, to avoid sort of round coin-shaped foods. But that's all the same as with conventional weaning. Let's not forget that with conventional weaning, it's always been recommended that you introduce finger foods or foods the baby can pick up from about 6 months. And yet all the panic about babies choking seems to be related to baby-led weaning. That doesn't make any sense. Finger foods have always been part of babies eating. In fact, if anything, baby-led weaning has flagged up the fact that babies should be in control of what goes in their mouth. Sorry, that wasn't a very short answer, but
that's a very good answer, don't worry. So it's really that as long as they are in control, they kind of know what they're doing, basically. And I do remember my son like pushing food, and then you start to hear that he's like kind of gag, and he keep pushing food. So as long as he was looking happy and he didn't seem to be in distress, I was kind of reassured that he knew what he was doing. So but yeah, it's always a bit stressful, but anything is stressful when we are parents for the first time anyway.
Tracy, did you want to say something about gagging and how that, learning through gagging?
Well, it's one of those things that I think it really teaches children to learn. People worry about gagging, but actually it's such a clear way that they learn. You often see babies with baby-led weaning take very, very small mouthfuls. They're very cautious to start with. Most of them are very cautious. And if they do put something too far back in their mouth, it makes them gag, and they very quickly learn not to do it. So some obviously learn quicker than others, but it doesn't normally last more than a few weeks, that sort of gagging phase where they're learning how far back they can put food in their mouth and not to overstuff their mouths. Whereas if they've been spoon-fed, if they're spoon-fed, it's much harder because it's harder to dislodge puree. If you imagine eating a spoonful of mashed potato and then you gag or you try and cough it up, it's much harder to get rid of that food. So if it's something that is making you gag, it's too far back, or you don't like it, then with baby-led weaning, you just cough it out. You just gag and it comes out. You expel the food. That's much harder for spoon-fed babies, and you do see them gagging and coughing as well. And for some reason, people think it's safer because it's a puree, but it's really not. You can choke on water, you can get anything stuck in your throat, and I think it's much more unpleasant when you film babies with different kinds of food. It's much more unpleasant if they're trying to get rid of a puree rather than a piece of food.
And you're talking about the quantities that they put in their mouth. And that was also one of the questions, basically, that some parents have observed, that babies tend to put a lot in their mouths. And so obviously it's probably linked to gagging. So they kind of a bit concerned, how much food they're going to put into their mouths. And are they going to learn to self-regulate? Do they need to give them less, like that they stop putting into their mouths? But that was a specific question when the parent was explaining that the child was asking for more, basically. He was like, trying to get food from the parent's plate, and he still adds food into his mouth. So, yeah, they were a bit concerned about, okay, do we need to do something about that? Do we need to self-regulate the child? Do we need to, or do we teach the child to take less into his mouth, or is it something that will come naturally? I bet it will, but I think that would be nice to have your experience on that.
I think it comes naturally as long as they're in control. So as long as nobody's sort of interfering and they're allowed to concentrate on what they're doing, then they can regulate that themselves. Because if they put too much in their mouths and they overstuff it, it's uncomfortable and they'll start gagging. So as long as they're allowed to concentrate on what they're doing, they can handle that. It's when other people are sort of interfering, it's very distracting for babies, and it actually prevents them from learning. They need to concentrate.
Yes. So I suppose it's really, it's really up to the parents to really trust the process and to know that the baby will be okay. And that basically they don't have to, as you say, interfere, because if they do, they're going to prevent the child to learn from the baby-led weaning experience, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah, I don't know how we can make sure that the parents are reassured, because it's probably the question you have the most. If you go, there are many groups here in the UK. Many Facebook groups, Baby-led Weaning Facebook groups. So I don't know if you are on those groups or anything, but it's always this kind of question. Despite the book, and the book is super well done. So at the time, it was 6 years ago. So I read that book, and it was enough for me. I was not going to ask. I did go on some website to try to find some recipes, in addition to the ones that was in the book, that were in the book. But I kind of decided that all the information was in the book, so I tried to trust the process. But now I feel that many parents, despite the book, still cannot be totally sure of what's going on. So I don't know. What can we say to the parents to make sure they really trust the process?
Gill, do you want to do that?
Yeah, I think that is the hardest part of baby-led weaning, is trusting the process and trusting your baby. All we can really say is just take a deep breath and do it. And your baby will very soon start to surprise you and repay that trust 100-fold. But it is a hugely difficult thing. Several people have said to us that, perhaps it doesn't help for people who are starting, but having learned to trust their baby with food, they actually have a lot more respect for their baby's abilities in other areas. So when they're toddlers, perhaps they're less fearful about them climbing on a climbing frame. I don't mean they don't supervise them, of course they do, but they're not so worried. They have a stronger sense that their baby is very keen to look after herself, basically, and keep herself safe, and knows how to do that. But I think Tracy's point about distraction is very important. And babies who are constantly fussed over at the table, or people trying to engage them in chat and not allowing them to focus on the food, it makes it more difficult for them. If any of those listening have ever read any books about mindful eating for adults, baby-led weaning is mindful eating for babies, and it means focusing on the sensations inside your mouth, on the colors, the textures, and so on, and being totally aware of the food. It's interesting that when babies are spoon-fed, often parents are advised, well, make eye contact with your baby, smile, engage him. Yes, but he should be focusing on the food, not on you. And so often babies who are spoon-fed are not really expecting that spoon to come into their mouth from somewhere that they aren't focused on. So baby-led weaning is in so many ways the opposite of that. And it's not to say that we can't chat to children while they're eating, of course, but the idea that we might want to take their focus away from the food is wrong.
Yeah, there's if I can just add, there's something that Gill and I do sometimes when we do talks. We get adults to spoon feed each other, and if somebody else is spoon feeding you, your natural reaction is to grab the spoon, to grab their hand, so you're controlling the spoon, because it actually makes you feel very vulnerable. And somebody else feeding you don't know quite how to manage the food in your mouth, and it's quite a scary thing as an adult. I think that's worth bearing in mind, that if somebody else is feeding you, that's quite a risky thing, because you don't know how to deal with that food.
I've it's a bit different, but when my grandmother was quite ill in the hospital, she had to be spoon-fed, and you could see that she hated that, and she refused basically to eat because it was, she was not in control. So I think that's a very good experience for parents to really experience the spoon, and that is not very comfortable. Even a plastic spoon, that's something that I don't advise to parents, like a normal teaspoon. It's so much more, tasty. If you taste a yogurt with a plastic spoon, it doesn't taste the same at all. And and that's very interesting what you say about mindful eating, because I think sometimes when we become a parent, we have our own issue with food, and when it's the time to feed our own babies with solid foods, and all those past issues might come back, diet or healthy eating or what we eat. And obviously we want our children to be healthier than us, so we kind of become anxious about how we're going to feed them. And definitely, personally, having children has really changed the way I eat, because obviously I was preparing food for my children, and I changed what I was eating so healthily. I was feeding my children so healthily that I was like thinking, okay, why do I eat that junk food next to my baby? You know, so you cannot really. you have to kind of look deeply into the way you eat and your past issues as well. And this idea that we kind of need to become mindful of our own diet makes sense. Yeah, another question was indeed about what kind of food we give to our children, and a bit of some questions about sweet food. Okay, when do we introduce that? And do you have any opinion about sugar? It's a big hot topic at the moment, with the sugar tax and so on, and with some experts saying that because the child will be in control, whatever is available is going to make the right choice, and some others saying that there is no need to introduce like desserts or pure sugar because it's not really the kind of food that we would come across if we were not living in nature. So I don't know if you have any opinion about that big hot sugar topic, but yeah.
Okay. Well, shall I go first, Jill?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the balance of the diet you have, your baby is going to share your meals, so you need to have a healthy diet. Nobody needs sugar, nobody needs junk food. So it does, as you said, Corinne, it really affects people's diet. They often change their diet for the better when they start baby-led weaning. If you have a sweet dessert every day, then your baby will learn to expect a sweet dessert every day. They don't need to, but if you have one, then they're having one too. So if you just have a piece of fruit or some stewed apple or something, then your baby can share that too, and it's healthier. The big thing with sweet food is not to make it a special thing. So if you have it as a family, then you have it as a family and your baby shares. If you don't have it, then you don't make it a special thing. Like, oh, if you eat your greens, you can have some ice cream. Because as soon as you do that, it gives that food a special value, and they will want that food more than any other food. And if you're completely neutral about sweet foods and biscuits and cakes, then it's just another food. And if everybody's having it, they might have a little bit, but it's not a big thing. I remember being at a party when my daughter was about 3, and they had all this, amazing food, lots of cakes, lots of biscuits, but they also had fruit. And somebody gave her a big slice of chocolate cake. She ate a little bit, put it down, and then she went off and got blueberries. And then she went off and got more blueberries because, the blueberries were sweet and she liked them. She didn't have any special value attached to the cake. So it's not really about allowing them or introducing them. It's if you have them, then they have them. So if you don't want your baby to have, ice cream and sweet things, then you just have them when your baby's not around, or you don't have them.
Yeah.
Your baby is going to want to copy you. That's the bottom line. So if your baby's copying
I think many mums are quite well used to eat biscuit behind some doors in the kitchen.
Yeah. Or you try and give them something that looks like your biscuit, and it'll fool them for a little while, but not for long.
Absolutely.
They want the same as you. They really do.
Okay. Yeah.
I think Can I just say something about that? I think and this is for all of us, and if our babies are going to eat the same food as us, then it's a message just for us. If we cut out junk food, ready meals, fizzy drinks, all of those things that are not real food, they're just sort of created food. And I don't mean forever. I mean, obviously, if there are special occasions, other people are eating those things, we're going to want to join in. But in general, if we don't eat those things, that will take care of a heck of a lot of the sugar issue. Whether you then have a spoonful of sugar in your tea, well, I don't know. But really, just cutting out the junk food would go a heck of a long way to dealing with the sugar and the salt issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember that I didn't Babyled my first, but obviously she started to grab our cups or glass at the table, and we were drinking Coke at the time. We were not that healthy. And then all of a sudden I said to my husband, we cannot drink Coke at the table because, how are you going to do that? She's going to grab our drinks. So it's, at some point, that's not going to make sense to say, no, you cannot drink that and you can drink that. So we kind of cut out the Coke first. That was our first step on the healthy diet. But yeah, definitely, I can see that I haven't been very conscious about that with my first, and definitely they have a sweet tooth. And, that's something that I'm aware of and working on and showing a good example because my own diet has totally changed. And, I do not eat any sweet food anymore unless I'm out and for a birthday or something like that, but we don't have sugar anymore in the house. So they kind of see me eating differently, and hopefully on the long term, that will make it up for those first years when I was not healthy, and obviously she was allowed to have anything I had, which was not really healthy. But, I was not, I didn't feel allowed to say no to her if I was eating, some chocolate spread on my bread, obviously. I'm from in Belgium and France. We eat a lot of Nutella. We grow up on that, I think. So, yeah, that's very interesting, and that's always reassuring. It's all about us, basically. We as a role model.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think if we stop and ask ourselves everything before we're about to offer it to our baby, what nutrition is this providing? And if the answer is not a lot, well, then we shouldn't be offering it. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. But I understand
that's
that
not
sometimes
just with baby-led weaning.
my children are older, say 10 and 6, and every time they go to a birthday party at schools, every time they go to the hairdresser, they are presented with sweet food. Yeah. So it's not just our own diet. It's like we kind of fighting constantly this kind of culture of, sweet foods are for children. Mm-hmm. And it's good, it's good to spoil them or something. And it's, sometimes it's hard. But we were at an event and they were doing little games. And obviously they were doing the games, they were allowed to choose a sweet, and my 2 children said no every time, and the people who were organizing that event said, oh wow, that's the first time ever it happened to me that a child said no to a sweet, and none of them were taking them, and we didn't say anything to them before that event, like don't take the sweets. We were not expecting the sweet, to be honest, but they said no, both of them. So ultimately it paid off apparently.
Not a big, if it's not a big thing, they're not going to crave it.
No. Okay, so another question was indeed about, when we go out, we have less choices, probably less healthy choices. So, and this idea as well, when you go out with a baby, I think at home, there is, if you have some risk of allergy, how do we do that? And then when we go out with that risk of allergy, how do we do that? Because the main idea also is to kind of be able to, when you go out, to just eat what is available, or is it more to be ready and have something for them to eat? It's a bit 2 questions. So let's say about what do we do when we go out, to restaurants or to friends? Do we get ready with some prepared food, or do we just trust the restaurant? And then there will be another question about allergies. I think that will be easier that way.
Okay. Do you want to go first, Tracy?
Okay, well, eating out is generally very easy. The things that you need to watch out for are things like sauces, which can be very, very salty, like a curry sauce or gravy. Any of those sauces that are prepared, or pasta sauce, they're often very, very salty in restaurants. So it's good to order something plain. You can usually have a side order of vegetables or something. And if it's something that you really think you don't want your baby to have, if it's really very unhealthy food, or you can't guarantee it, then you can just, take out a little pot of, little bits of meat or little bits of vegetables or fruit. But generally, there's something on the menu that a baby can have, bearing in mind they're not going to eat huge quantities. Some people, if they're at a friend's house and it's a very, very salty sauce, say on pasta, they might just rinse the sauce off a little bit, or if it's on meat or something, you can just sort of take off a little bit of the sauce. But if it's not every day, it's not a huge issue. You just need to sort of bear in mind it's mainly the salt and the sort of real rubbish things that you want to keep to a minimum.
Okay.
But generally, I think eating out is easy actually with baby-led weaning. Yeah, Jill, did you want to talk about allergies with?
Allergies is interesting. We're now being told that there's no need to withhold foods except if there's a known problem with an allergy in the child's immediate family, so parents or siblings, that we're actually better off giving babies or offering them the chance to eat all of the normally considered potential allergens, like peanuts, not as whole peanuts obviously, but as peanut butter, say, or in cooking, dairy products. Just we should introduce them in the normal way from about 6 months. The interesting thing when it comes to going out, then we would treat the allergy risk. We don't have to think about it as a particular risk, as I say, unless there's a strong family history in the immediate family. But if the baby has already been shown to be allergic, well, then it would be just like if there was an adult in the group who was allergic. You would find out from the restaurant beforehand whether there was a risk, what dishes were safe, and so on. You'd treat it the same way. We don't have to do it differently for babies until and unless there's a proven problem. But one of the things that fascinates me about baby-led weaning is I've heard several stories now about babies avoiding foods that they later on turn out to be allergic to. It seems they know what foods are safe for them to eat and what aren't. And of course, with baby-led weaning, because foods aren't all blended together, they're usually able to pick out different things from within, let's say a casserole, and avoid the foods that they feel they need to. I can think of a story I was told a while ago of a boy who was in his teens before it was discovered that he was allergic to nuts. And he'd always sniffed his food before he ate it, which his parents thought was just a bit quirky. But it seems he knew what smell he was looking for, and he avoided certain foods as a result. What was interesting to me was his mother said... Sorry, there's a strange feedback on the line. His mother said, "Isn't that amazing? He kept himself safe." And I said to her, well, actually, you kept him safe because you never forced him to eat anything that he didn't want to. So this comes back to trust again. Mm-hmm. Babies are usually doing things for a reason. We may not know the reason at the time, but it's very unlikely to be anything that's actually the reason being anything that would be harmful to them. If anything, they may be protecting themselves in a way that we can't tell.
Yeah, that's interesting. Definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for all of that already. I learn a lot every time. And we don't have many watching live because obviously it's a time when they feed the baby, when they put the baby to sleep, around 7. So I know we have a few watching, so I'm just going to see if there's some questions. And, I would be interested if you can, introduce your other books together, because I have no idea. And it's just when I started to do a bit of research for these interviews that I discovered that you have the baby-led breastfeeding. That's very interesting. And you also have the baby-led parenting. So if you want to introduce those 2 books like that, I will make sure, I will post a link to those 2 books and let the members of this group check them out, because, if they're in line with what you say already in your main book, Baby-led Weaning, I think they will be interesting. So if you want to just explain a bit, the story behind those 2 books and,
okay,
how they can help parents.
Okay, well, we've got 2 other, the main baby-led weaning book, the first one, and 2 cookbooks. So they're full of recipes, baby-led weaning, so sort of healthy, safe recipes for baby-led weaning. And then we did one on, we've got one on breastfeeding. We have both worked at different times in breastfeeding. I'm a voluntary breastfeeding supporter for mums at the moment, so I'm kind of in drop-in breastfeeding groups, usually once a week. And Jill, I know, did that for many years. The breastfeeding book is really sort of very baby-led. It's based on the same kind of principles that It's about development, working with your baby's development and understanding their development. So you're not sort of fighting what they're trying to do, and you're not fighting their instincts. So you're kind of working together to when you're breastfeeding. You're not at odds with each other. Lots of mothers and their babies are kind of at odds with each other because the mother expects the baby to act differently, or doesn't quite understand what the baby's trying to tell her. So it's very much based on natural child development as well. And the same with baby-led parenting. That's a more general book about all sorts of aspects of parenting, thinking about it while you're pregnant and working out how you're going to approach it. And it's really from birth and covers breastfeeding, baby-led weaning, sleep, all kinds of things, play. And again, it's based on child development. Yeah. Gill, do you want to say anything?
They're brilliant books, obviously. They're must-have.
They get very good reviews.
I just actually wanted to go back to an earlier question you were asking about the Montessori approach, and just say that, and this is not meant as a criticism of the approach. I have an awful lot of time for it, and I've always been interested in it. But I think it's really important to imagine how it might have evolved if Maria Montessori, for example, was still alive. You know, what has been written about it was begun and practiced originally in the days when solid foods were introduced much earlier. In a lot of households, you know, certainly the upmarket ones, babies were seen and not heard. We now have a very different approach to parenting, which incorporates a lot of the sort of things that Maria Montessori seemed to care about. But I really firmly believe that if she were alive today, she would be embracing baby-led weaning or something very like it, because it's so clearly child-led, baby-led, that I can't imagine she would have a big problem with it. She might present it slightly differently from us, but it's, when you think about, for example, the child sitting down at the little table with cutlery and so on, back in the days when children were normally fed by their parents, and they were nearly always given pureed foods and so on, the natural transition was seen as the baby starting to take the spoon for himself. So the idea of picking up a piece of meat and putting it for the baby to do that and put it in their mouth themselves just it wasn't discussed, it wasn't imagined. But in fact, that's exactly what baby-led weaning is. And I just wonder if we could just see the way the whole of our approach to bringing up children has developed, and imagine how Montessori might embrace that, then perhaps we have something that's a little less confining than the way some people see Montessori education. I don't know if that's a fair comment. Also, the other thing, that when I've studied it, what I've understood is that Montessori has a lot to say about what happens when children are together in a nursery type setting, but what should be happening when perhaps solid foods are being introduced to a young baby at home is less clear. So baby-led weaning is a sort of bridge to the gap there that perhaps hasn't been very well expanded on in Montessori writings. I apologize if I've got that wrong, but that's my impression.
I think that's very interesting, and I totally agree with you. We kind of have to put the thing into the context. She was a doctor at the time, you know. Being able to bottle feed a baby, you know, safely was a big advancement in medicine, because obviously some mothers were not able to breastfeed, so we were saving babies thanks to the bottle feeding. So for her, it was an advancement, and obviously following the bottle feeding, it was quite of natural to do spoon feeding to make sure that children were receiving, you know, the kind of food they were supposed to get, and healthy food, and all the nutrients. So all part of that context around, you know, as you said, spoon feeding at the time was very different. So, and her being a doctor, you know, she was not against the medical advice of the time. She was a doctor herself. So obviously her approach was more in line with that. And also she was working mainly with families who were having nannies, basically, with wealthy families who were having nannies. So it was more natural to teach the nanny to feed the child at a slow table, like a bit like a daycare, but it was in the family. So all of that is linked to that, obviously. And one of the main books about the 0 to 3 period has been written after her by people who were trained by her, and it was in the 50s, 60s. So obviously, it's a bit outdated, especially all the chapter about breastfeeding is very annoying for me because I don't think it's in line with natural breastfeeding. And but it's not written by Maria Montessori. Obviously, it has been written by people after her, and so that way, different Montessori teachers will have a different approach. But I'm totally with you on that. And Maria Montessori quote. She said in one of her books that moms used to have the babies all the time with them, and that was a natural way to do that. And obviously, it was the beginning of the 20th century, so moms were going to work in factories. She was working with, families from poor community where both parents had to go to work. So basically, she kind of set up one of the first daycare. So, her advice were in line with that, with allowing moms to be able to go to work. And so obviously, all the advice were as well, yes, to give the most respectful daycare as possible to the children, but it's not really what you would offer in the house. And unfortunately, she was talking to parents every time she could. And now we have some books about the lectures she gave to parents, and we can see that, she was all about a natural upbringing and a respectful upbringing of the children, definitely. So I do believe as well that she would totally be in agreement with baby-led weaning. It's very, very interesting what you were saying. Absolutely. Yeah, I totally agree with that. I'm very baby-led weaning Montessori teacher.
Yeah. It's all about respect for the child, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's the same as well. I know that many parents are a bit confused with sleep because, there is a big emphasis within the Montessori community about independence. But it doesn't mean that the child has to sleep by himself, by 6 months of age. We don't force anything. So we respect the child. If the child, and that was again with the sleep, with that idea of the child being in a cot, for a very long time in the 30s, 20s, and the idea of having a child in his own toddler bed was unheard of. And the idea to have that child coming to the family room and disturbing the parents was very annoying for the parents at the time. And so basically they didn't want to have this kind of sleep. So Maria Montessori changed that, saying that, okay, we need to try floor bed because basically, children, they have their own needs, they want to be independent. And she pushed with that. But it doesn't mean that we need to put a baby in his own bedroom by 6 months of age. It's not this kind of independence she was pushing. She was promoting the kind of natural independence, basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy that I have you tonight, that you came and that you chat with us, because it was extremely interesting for me. And I will definitely check out those 2 books that I didn't know about. And do you have anything else that you want to add?
No, just thank you very much, and I'm sorry I was late, and it's
don't worry.
been a pleasure to talk to you. Really nice, really interesting.
Thank you.
For me too, I've really enjoyed it. And just if parents talk to each other about baby-led weaning, they will gain the confidence to trust their babies, I think.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.